All right, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our Heritage Advisory Committee meeting, July 11th. It is 6:03, and we're going to call this meeting to order. Okay, so we'll begin with our land acknowledgement. Have it in front of me here. The Niagara region and Grimsby are situated on treaty land. This land is steeped in the rich history of the First Nations, such as the Haudenosaunee, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe, including the Mississaugas of the Credit of First Nation. There are many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people from across Turtle Island that live and work in Niagara today. The regional municipality of Niagara and Grimsby stand with all Indigenous peoples, past and present, in promoting the wise stewardship of the land on which we live. Thank you. Are there any disclosures of pecuniary interests today? Okay, awesome. We'll move on then to, Bianca's going to say something.
Thank you, through the chair. For the approval of the agenda, I was just going to ask if we can please move the letter from correspondence under written delegation as 7.3. That way we can discuss the item with the rest of the business.
That sounds good to me. Everyone else? Sounds good? Do you have to do anything for that?
You just have to pass the motion to approve the agenda as amended.
Okay. I'll have a resolution in front of me then to approve the agenda as amended. Do I have a mover? Wonderful, Brian. Okay, resolved then that the July 11th, 2023 Grimsby Heritage Advisory Committee agenda be approved as amended. Okay, next up, what's that? All in favor, thank you. Thank you, all in favor, thank you. I'm still getting used to the whole process here. I appreciate that. All right, we're now going to move on to the adoption of previous minutes. Do we have a mover for this item? All right, Councillor DeFlavio, thank you. Just a mover now that we're in the simplified version. I think we just need a mover, right?
Yep.
Okay, so yeah, just one mover. Thank you for that. All right, so resolved then that the committee minutes of June 13th, 2023 be approved. All in favor? Wonderful, thank you. Okay, next up we have a presentation about the Heritage Conservation District study. And first up, we have our consultants from Stantec, Leisha Jones and Megan Rivard, to present. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I think if Bianca can give us the screen sharing capabilities, I'll share a presentation. I think we'll leave our videos off while we present. We tend to get a bit, things get a bit choppy that way, but we're happy to turn them back on to answer questions afterwards. Okay, can you guys see the presentation here?
Lasha, we're seeing the back end where your notes are.
Okay, hang on. All right, let's try that again. Nope, still there. Megan, are you able to pull it up? I don't know why it's giving me issues on that front.
Yep. Stand by.
I feel like these settings are different on every platform. In Teams, it seems to work. Zoom seems to have different opinions about how to do this.
Can everyone see my screen?
Yes, we can, Lasha.
Okay, perfect. So thank you for having us tonight. I'm Lasha Jones. I'm with Megan Rivard here. We're with Stantec Consulting. So today we're going to provide a brief presentation that gives you an overview of the Grimsby Heritage Conservation District, or HCD for short, and its recommendations. Megan, if you could go to the next slide. We want to give you a quick overview of the HCD process, its study area, a project recap, and then we want to dive into some of the specifics of the HCD study updates and our recommendations before going over the next steps. There's a lot of information in this presentation. I want to be brief because I want to also allow lots of time for staff to give their report and for questions of the committee. We are happy to pull the presentation back up and recall slides later on if needed. Next slide. And next slide. So our team at Stantec has prepared numerous HCDs across the province of varying types. For newer committee members, I'd like to give a very brief overview of what HCDs are and their process. In a nutshell, HCDs are areas that are designated under Part 5 of the Ontario Heritage Act to conserve its heritage character. They consist of two phases: an HCD study that determines if an area or part of it demonstrates significant heritage value to be an HCD. And if so, an HCD plan may be prepared at the direction of Council that puts in place policies and guidelines for managing change, including modifications to existing buildings, new development, and demolition. Current community input is important in both phases. And right now we are currently at the end of the HCD study phase, or at the end of phase 1. Next slide. On this map, you'll see the study area for the Grimsby HCD outlined in red and properties that are currently listed or designated by the town in the various shades of purple. Next slide. To complete the HCD study, our team conducted historical research to understand how Grimsby developed and how this affected its existing character. As you'll see here on the slide, the team identified a few key periods of historical development that are related to Grimsby's history of fruit growing, the electric railway, and post-war development in the community. Next slide. The map on the screen here shows the ranges of construction periods for buildings within the study area, which range all the way from the mid-19th century to recent developments. Next slide. Our research and analysis noted several different architectural styles present in the study area, including vernacular, contemporary, mid-century modern and minimal traditional, as well as some Queen Anne, Italianate, and other historical styles or influences. Architectural character can include things like fruit barns that are a unique element to the study area. In terms of building materials, the predominant building material we have in the study area is brick cladding, with some other materials mixed in, with such as contemporary siding and limited examples of stone, stucco, or other materials. Building heights within the study area range from primarily 1 to 3 stories, with some outliers and some open space due to vacant land, parks, or other areas. The study team also identified several landmark properties that are based on the town's historical development, property inventory, and public consultation. You can see these here on the screen.
Sorry, Lasha, just to interrupt for a second. I don't know if folks can see on my screen. Has Walter been admitted? Do I need to do anything there?
Through the chair, Megan, I've let him in. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll carry on to the next slide. So it's common in large study areas for distinct character areas to emerge, and that's what we found here in Grimsby. We noted 4 different character areas that differ from each other in terms of their built and landscape environment. What we identified, we called the Grimsby downtown, outlined in blue there, the area shaded in blue, the historic residential core, shaded in green, Nels to Boslaw corridor in orange, and the east end there in brown. I'll talk a little bit more about their individual characters later on in this presentation when I discuss how we evaluated the project. So to give a bit of a recap of the project, you'll see now on the screen a review of what we've completed to date for the HCD study. In October 2022, our team submitted the draft study report to the town for presentation to the Heritage Grimsby Advisory Committee. However, in late 2022, around that time, changes were proposed to the Ontario Heritage Act through Bill 23, the More Homes Built Faster Act. So with the royal assent of Bill 2023 that came in late 2022, the review of the study was paused. In January 2023, when these changes to the Ontario Heritage Act came into effect, we began discussions with the town to update the HCD study in accordance with those new changes. Since January, our team has been working to update the HCD study following the amendments from the Ontario Heritage Act. The changes to the Ontario Heritage Act resulted in a specific change to how HCD studies are prepared. In the past, there were no defined criteria for how an HCD was, for how merit was determined in an HCD, and it was based on several factors that were established through best practices and ministry guidance. Now, to merit consideration for designation as an HCD, 25% of the properties within the study area must satisfy 2 or more of the criteria here shown on the slide. And the HCD criteria is provided on, sorry, Megan, can you go back to that slide? This criteria here will look familiar to many of you. It's adapted from Ontario Regulation 906 that is used for individual structures. However, it's been modified slightly to apply to HCD study areas, and you can see that in the last section where it refers to properties plural and talks about how they are defined, planned, or are themselves a landmark. So the language is very slightly different than what we use for determining individual value in Part 4. Next slide. Because the HCD study and its recommendations were prepared prior to the updates to Bill 23, but not submitted to Council, the updates were needed to reevaluate the study area with the new evaluation criteria. So to do this, our team updated the inventory forms for each property in the study area to include the 9 criteria of Ontario Regulation 906 that you saw on the previous screen. Next, the study team evaluated each property following the new criteria from a screening level or a high level using the inventory form. To determine historical or associative value, we identified key themes from the historical research that had already been completed for the project. The data from ArcGIS that we used for our inventory was exported into an Excel spreadsheet that we analyzed the number of properties that met the criteria and the overall percentages. So the evaluation of the study area determined that more than 25% of the properties within the study area as a whole met true criteria. 130 properties, or 44%, were determined to satisfy criterion 1, as they contained a structure representative of a particular architectural style or a building of a specific type. 126 properties, or 42%, were determined to satisfy criterion 4, as containing property related to a theme, key theme or significant family. However, despite meeting these criteria, it's our team's opinion that while it meets the minimum threshold for the study area in its entirety does not merit designation as an HCD. The properties that meet the criteria under Regulation 906 for an HCD are dispersed throughout the study area and do not necessarily share historical or contextual relationships with one another that are typically found in HCD areas. The variety in character is a result of various periods of historical development and ongoing use, improvements, and time. To bridge this gap, our project team also evaluated the study area using the Ontario Heritage Toolkit characteristics that we used in the prior to Bill 23 coming into effect. Next slide, maybe. So the toolkit characteristics are how we have always evaluated HCDs, and unlike the numerical threshold, they help get at some of the nuances, intangibles, and the look and feel that is often part of HCDs. So following evaluation of the study area against the HCD characteristics based on the toolkit, it was determined again not to merit recommendation for consideration of an HCD as a whole. While the study area itself does contain heritage resources, landmarks, and significant views, these are spread throughout the entire study area with contemporary infill or open spaces or parking lots, which break up the streetscape and results in a lack of overall visual cohesiveness in the area. Next slide, Megan. So I just want to pause here for a second and say that because the HCD study identified distinct character areas within the larger study area that we mentioned previously. We also wanted to focus our evaluation on each individual character area to see if those character areas met the 25% threshold. And we also applied the toolkit characteristics to each of these character areas for a consistent approach as well. Next slide, Nina. So for the Grimsby downtown area here, shown in blue, more than 25% of the total 99 properties were determined to meet 3 criteria of Ontario 906 as indicated on the slide here for design, historic, or contextual value. However, while this area does contain a concentration of heritage resources identified in its evaluation according to Regulation 906, the infill which has occurred interrupts the sense of cohesiveness in the pedestrian realm of the area. Varying heights, ages, and particularly architectural styles tends to weaken the merit of the area as a district, as the streetscape is not of a cohesive historical character. The area is representative of a typical Ontario commercial core, but does not connect directly to the unique history of Grimsby as a fruit-growing region. So following evaluation of the Grimsby downtown core against the characteristics provided in the toolkit, we were determined not to meet merit recommendation for consideration as an HCD. So as such, other planning recommendations and tools for this area are recommended that we'll discuss a little bit later. For the historic residential core, more than 25% of the 57 properties were determined to meet 4 criteria of Ontario Regulation 906 as depicted in the slide here for design, historic, and contextual values. In addition to that, we found that the historic residential core met all of the toolkit characteristics as well. The area contains a concentration of late 19th to early 20th century properties that are related to Grimsby fruit industry boom, including remaining fruit farms and outbuildings. Lands within this area, including 2 identified landmark properties, are connected to the Nels family, who are significant to the development of Grimsby more broadly. The area is predominantly residential with consistent setbacks of deep front yards composed of mature trees and ornamental gardens. This area also includes the neutral First Nations burial ground. While the area has 2 periods of development with infill that began in the mid-20th century situated alongside the historic properties, the key heritage features remain and warrant conservation for their continued longevity and ability to contribute to the historical narrative of the area. As such, the historic residential core has merit for consideration as an HCD. For the Nels to Beausejour corridor, again, more than 25% of the total 90 properties were determined to meet 2 criteria of Ontario Regulation 906 as depicted on the slide here for their design and historic values. Similar to the downtown core, while this area retains some 19th century residences and some former fruit barns and outbuildings, these are landmark structures and the heritage value of these structures is focused on an individual scale. Most of these structures within the Nels or Beausejour corridor are associated with the growth of Grimsby during the mid-20th century, and there's been significant infill between the identified heritage resources. Therefore, the Nels to Beausejour corridor was not determined to merit consideration as an HCD. Next slide, Megan. And the East End only met 1 criterion for historic value. This means it didn't reach the threshold for consideration as an HCD, therefore it did not merit consideration as an HCD. Same thing for the East End evaluation. It did not meet the characteristics based on the toolkit, given that it's a late development, usually post-1980, with contemporary structures and a lack of heritage integrity. While this area does retain 4 late 19th century residences, these properties have heritage value on an individual scale. So to sum up our evaluation, 1 character sub-area, the historic residential core, merits consideration as an HCD because it meets both the 25% threshold of the OHA criteria, as well as the toolkit characteristics. What is important to note here is that the additional evaluation that we did resulting from the Ontario Heritage Act changes reinforced the conclusions that the study initially came to at the end of 2022. So as mentioned, the updated analysis and evaluation in the HCD identified that historical residential core character sub-area merits consideration as a heritage conservation district. Given this finding, the HCD study is recommending the preparation of an HCD plan and guidelines for this area. For the areas outside of the recommended HCD boundary, policy reviews and Part 4 designations have been recommended. You can see here on the slide the proposed HCD boundary. It consists of the properties along both sides of Main Street East between Robson Street and Mells Road. This boundary may be subject to change during the development of the HCD plan. However, we determined that these boundaries capture the cultural heritage value or interest identified and represents a cohesive collection of heritage resources. The next steps for this project include the presentation of the draft HCD study to the Planning Committee and members of Council. I'll now turn things over to town staff for their presentation on their report, and we're happy to answer any questions that come up. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Are there any questions from the committee? Yes, Member Riley.
Through you, Chair. Thank you for the presentation, really informative. Just one quick question. Towards the end there in your recommendations, you made a comment about the boundaries are subject to change during the designation process. What sort of things would impact the boundaries? What kind of things have you seen in other studies that do have impacts on the boundaries?
It's a really good question. Usually we find that if the boundary changes, it can be at the direction of staff or council. Usually as consultants, we like to stick with the boundary that's recommended, but there have been cases in other HCDs where council makes a decision to expand or shrink the boundary for whatever reason, and that's what they go with. So usually it's at the direction of council.
That's great. Are there any other questions? Okay. Oh, thank you. Yes, to Flavio.
Thank you, through you, Chair. So I guess my question is more of a general one, and I don't know if it's for the consultants or for the staff, but when we look at it as a whole, it's easy to understand the reason for a heritage district, because you want to preserve the character of the entire stretch. When you start to divide it into little pieces like this, I'm concerned that it doesn't meet the original reason behind this investigation in the first place. So if you can give a background, or if the consultants give a background about why this was initiated in the first place, so that we can kind of understand if this is meeting what we're trying to achieve with the Heritage District. Because, I mean, frankly, I could think of other areas of Grimsby that are more urgent and more cohesive as a Heritage District than one little parcel between these couple of streets in the east end of Grimsby. Again, if we looked at it as a whole, now that the downtown is seen as not part of this, and we're dividing it into this one little part that is really of value, I'm having a difficulty understanding the purpose and the value of a heritage district. So I don't know if the consultant can explain that, or if staff can explain that, or if that's explained in your presentation, which is coming forward later. It's just, and if that's too general, I apologize. It's just, when I looked at it at first, I thought it was a whole thing. Now that I see it's a small part of that whole thing, it's kind of losing its value for me. I don't know. I don't know if that makes sense or not, and if that can be explained, I'd appreciate it.
I'm happy to take a start at answering that question, and then happy to let staff chime in too if they've got anything they want to add about the boundary. But in HCD studies, it's not uncommon to start with a really large boundary and have it shrink down as the process unfolds. Starting with that large boundary often gives the team kind of the broad sweeps area to do all of that research and evaluation and come up with what really kind of floats to the top in terms of meeting those criteria, meeting those characteristics that we talk about in terms of having that visual cohesion and a sense of character and place and time and things like that. The other thing that we want to touch on too is that HCDs have to be really robust and defensible. HCDs are appealable to the Ontario Land Tribunal, so to try and designate an area that's really, really big, if it doesn't meet all of the criteria or if it doesn't meet the characteristics, can be really challenging. if it becomes appealed later on in the process. So that's why we really try and focus on areas that meet the criteria, meet the characteristics, and have a really strong and high concentration of heritage resources. And it's, again, not uncommon to start with a much bigger area and shrink it down based on the findings of the study. It doesn't mean that other areas in the town, outside of this can't be protected in other ways or can't be considered for other planning mechanisms to conserve heritage. And it doesn't mean that they don't have any character or aren't special in any way, but to be considered as a district, the rationale needs to be really robust and defensible. And that's what we've identified here in the recommended area.
Yeah, and I'm happy to add a little bit of perspective too, from the kind of origins of the study, and then we'll happily pass it through to staff, because I suspect it's a layered question that you asked, and I'm sure we can get into some of the details here, specific to the Grimsby HCD study. So initially looking at, as Lasha mentioned, that kind of core area, by expanding the study area and looking to the boundaries, we were able to better understand the areas of concentration. Beyond that, when you talk about why this was chosen, that was at the direction of council. So it goes back a few years as far as this area being selected for study. So certainly appreciating that there are other spaces and other neighborhoods in Grimsby that may warrant consideration for a district. Typically, the process that is executed when it comes to heritage conservation districts is that you begin with a study and then you move into a plan phase, should there be merit and at the direction of council. So that's kind of how we got where we are here. We're very much at the study phase, and while certainly there are other areas that the community may want to identify for consideration as an HCD, the focus here has been on the wider study area here, and by looking at subcharacter areas based on the historical understanding of an area, it allows for that defensible boundary to be formed. So happy to get into some additional questions and pass it to staff if you wanted to add anything, or maybe open the floor for other questions and we can hear the staff report as well.
All right, Bianca, you want to add something?
Thank you, through the chair. Just to give the committee a background, so originally this started as our Heritage Committee considering doing a cultural heritage landscape along the Main Street East corridor, and ultimately council decided to proceed with the Heritage Conservation District, and there was also a notice of motion that was brought forward. I did mention that within the staff recommendation report that a notice of motion came forward. So it was really through that, in consultation with the Heritage Committee, that the initial study area was developed. And then when the consultants came in, there was some adjacent properties that they felt should be included. So we finalized that design, or that study area, and then it was further evaluated. And then Lasha and Megan kind of talked about how that assessment was carried out. So I hope that answers your question.
Okay, thank you all for answering Councillor DeFlavio's questions. So are there any other questions for the consultants at this time? Okay. Okay, just a question to get the copy of the presentation. Okay, so Bianca's suggesting that we, and I'm going to put it to the committee if this is the best way forward, that instead of kind of putting forward all these resolutions and breaking up the conversation, to just go on to the staff report, go on to the delegates, and then make all the resolutions at the end. Does everyone sound okay with that? Then hopefully the conversation will be a little bit more like a dialogue rather than broken up. Okay, with that then, I'm going to pass over to Bianca to provide a staff report for the HDC study.
Thank you, through you, the chair. Good evening, everyone. I just wanted to provide an overview of the staff recommendation report. The following overview and recommendations have been prepared by staff following for the Grimsby Heritage Advisory Committee following the completion of the Main Street East Heritage Conservation District study. And the recommendations referenced within this presentation are a result of the study and the findings from our consultants. So on the slide here, you'll see a chart that provides an overview of the different phases. So we've now completed phase 1 of the study. The purpose of phase 1 is to determine if the study area or sub-character areas meet the threshold for the legislative criteria. If the study area does meet the threshold, then it can be considered as a district. And the community involvement in phase 1 was to help identify the value within the corridor. If council chooses to proceed to phase 2, then the community will again be provided several opportunities to provide feedback and guidance on the policies and the establishment of an HCD plan and design guidelines. And then at the very end, council will designate the area by bylaw. So we'll go through that whole process and have some additional engagement. I'm gonna, next slide, please. So on this slide, you can see where the engagement will be taking place. So this is an overview of the HCD process and next steps. So the ones in green have been completed, and you can see the last green is where we are today. So this is where Heritage Committee provides recommendation on the technical merit for the area as a district. Then it will proceed to council, and then if council chooses to move forward, we'll prepare the HCD plans and guidelines, and you can see that there'll be 2 to 3 more engagement opportunities within that step. And then public notification will be served to everyone in the property, or sorry, everyone in the recommended boundary. And then a designation bylaw will be established, and that bylaw will include the final properties included in the designation, and the plan will be implemented. And that'll move to next step where it's officially designated and the bylaw is passed. And then again, notice will be served that the bylaw was passed, and then there's still an objection period. And as you can see, the stars are the opportunities for engagement. Next slide, please. So this is some of the feedback we received from the study and just some of the staff comments. So we received a lot of feedback for the conservation of the cultural heritage along the Main Street corridor. The community provided insight on notable landmarks, gateways, pathways, views, vistas, and the retention of heritage resources related to the tender fruit farming industry. We also had a strong push for the conservation of attributes associated with our Indigenous communities. And we also had community voice concerns with the scale, mass, and density associated with new development in the area. And then we also had received a lot of feedback from our heritage property owners, where they voiced their growing concerns with impacts to property value, obtaining affordable insurance, and increase in heritage restoration costs, and the need for tax incentives. So staff have provided some comments for heritage homeowners. So we always stress that heritage property owners, please reach out to staff so we can support you wherever we can. We've been working with insurance and real estate professionals to better understand the industries so that we can support you better. For our some of the insurance pieces, we've been working with insurance professionals to understand the process, and also to understand better what is happening and why homeowners are having a difficult time obtaining insurance. So we've been talking with those professionals to better understand the unique situations where this is occurring. And we do have a lot of materials to provide homeowners during that time. And I also wanted to speak to during restoration projects. So the town has developed a list of tradespeople that come highly recommended and complete really well-done restoration work. And we're here to support homeowners to make sure that the restoration projects are being completed to the greatest quality. And then in addition to that, we also have a heritage restoration grant that a lot of heritage homeowners have used. And through that program, you're able to get well-done restoration work. And then in addition to that, we also have the piece on the real estate professionals. We've been working with them to better understand the sale of heritage properties. And we've also learned from this consultation that the training material provided to realtors during their courses speaks to Ontario Heritage Act protections. And because the Heritage Act helps to maintain these buildings in good condition, they tend to sell for a lot higher. So that's some of the work we've been doing to support homeowners, and we really encourage everyone to reach out. We're also working on incentives, including we're reviewing right now the tax incentive. And then in addition to that, we're also looking at paint grants, window restoration grants, masonry grants, and different incentives like that. And we also encourage homeowners to reach out for additional support in areas where we're missing something. We can help to fill that void. Next slide. So now I wanted to provide an overview of our recommendations following review of the document prepared by the consultants. Staff recommend that the consultants' recommended boundary, known as the historic residential core, be designated under Part 5 of the Ontario Heritage Act, and that staff work with the consultants to commence the second phase of the study and develop the associated district plan and guidelines, and that the properties in the Appendix B of our report be considered for designation following the recent passing of Bill 23, and that prioritization be given to Part 4 designations for properties located within the downtown core. Next slide, please. So these are the properties from Appendix B, and I just wanted to note, the majority of these properties are protected under Section 27 of the Heritage Act. That provides demolition protection, but that protection is being removed on January 1st, 2025. So with that in mind, we do want to prioritize these buildings for review, but they're not being recommended for designation tonight. I just want to be very clear on that. These are just ones being identified as having value. They'll all need to be individually assessed against the Ontario regulation criteria, and then staff will reach out to each homeowner and work with them through the process. And we'll have to come back to Heritage Committee again and Council, so there'll be ample opportunities to provide your feedback and for us to engage with the property owner. So that's my presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Bianca, for your presentation. Does the committee have any questions? Oh, to Flavio, yes, go ahead.
So if you could put the list back up there. And I apologize for my lack of understanding, but I've never dealt with the Heritage Conservation District before. What's the advantage of the district over individual designation of each of these properties? Because, I mean, there are properties in between these that are not being designated that will not be impacted by, like a newer home that was built, because there are townhouses in this area that were built 5 years ago, 6 years ago. There's a school that is not of heritage value in this area. So what's the advantage of doing the district rather than the individual properties? I understand that, because from my perspective, and let me just explain what I mean. When I think of a district, I think of something that has clearly a cohesive. So I think of Grimsby Beach. That's the example that comes to mind. I think of that as one that was developed. Many of the homes were developed at the same time. There is a clear history to the area that unites the area. Here we have a variety of homes that were built over 80 to 100 years gap in some of those houses that were listed. That doesn't really, I mean, the cohesive part is that they're in the same kind of area of Grimsby, but I don't really think of this as a district from a personal perspective. And that's why I'm trying to understand the advantage of this rather than individual. I'm not opposed to the designation. So if they came forward individually, because obviously our consultants have made it clear that each of these properties meets the criteria for designation, in their opinion. I'm just trying to understand the purpose of a district, because, and I'll leave it at that, and then if you can answer that, I'll have a couple of other questions, please.
Through the chair. Sorry. I'll stop sharing. So I think there's benefits to each type of protection. When you have a district, you're obviously wanting to protect a cohesive cluster of resources that contribute to the overall value of the area, where individual is more site-specific history associated with that site. So my understanding from this assessment is that all of these together, we have a lot of the original pieces of what was an original tender fruit farming kind of like area hub. So they want to protect the shared history of that area by having the estates from the height of that hub. And then you obviously have the infill that comes in through the different eras, which I think each era adds a different value to that corridor. So it would help you basically maintain change over time. So as this corridor evolves, you have guidelines in place that help you to manage the change so that you're keeping that cohesive feel of that street while new modern layers are being implemented into the corridor.
Okay, thank you. Like I said before, when I think of a district, I think of something where there would be a sign, welcome to whatever that district is. And I don't know where this district begins and ends, frankly, and in between there are some significant gaps. I just don't, and I'm not trying to be difficult, I just don't, I've lived in Grimsby all my life, I don't think of this as a district, as something that I think of as a whole. Now, again, I think that each one of these individually is very important, so please don't misunderstand me. We're talking about it as a district, and the original exercise of the district, I think, was a political exercise, not a heritage exercise, intended to keep some land to control development. And none of the properties that we're talking about here are large properties that are of significant development potential, I don't think. If I'm wrong, please again correct me. But, so, I think we're missing I know what the outcome will be. I don't think that this was the original intent of this. I think that I wasn't part of the motion that came forward, but I think that motion came out of frustration over an inability to control Main Street East and a feeling like heritage was being lost. I don't know that this solves that problem. And I think that some of the properties that still are of potential development, have potential development in the future, are part of this list. So I still don't think it solves that problem, either whether from a political or from a heritage perspective. I'm not sure that it solves that problem. Now, I don't want to waste the efforts that have been made here to put this together. And if staff feels that it's a cohesive area, that's fine. I just don't get it. Like, I really don't. And again, I'm not trying to be difficult. I think you understand that I appreciate heritage and that I understand that each one of these is an individual property, is of heritage value. I just don't see it as a district, frankly. That's my personal opinion. And if others have a different opinion, then, I respect that and I'm willing to listen. That's all.
Through the chair, I just wanted to note the exercise was council asked for us to go out and see if this defined area meets the criteria under the Heritage Act, and it did. So now it's up to council. Do they want to proceed with the district here? So yeah, I'll give it back to the chair. Thank you.
Thank you for those comments. I think that it's interesting, from my understanding, this is the first phase in the next, and then there's another phase after this where maybe we can flesh out what those stories are, and maybe there is a plaque that goes up, or maybe there is a way where their community can create a cohesive narrative for the space that has been identified through the consultants and the studies we've done with the community. So I do wonder, I'm interested to see what happens as you define a space, a district, I think there is an evolution of how we see that neighborhood, and it could evolve to look more cohesive than what you picture it now as someone that's been here your whole life. So I'm kind of interested to see as we, decide what the policies are and the bylaws and what it looks like, I think there is opportunity to make more of a cohesive story than what we see as community members, like, who've lived here our lives, but clearly there is a cohesive story to tell, so now it's up to us to tell that story, is how I interpret it. Yeah, go ahead.
And I don't want to get off topic, but for me, that story includes Main Street West, for example. So if we were creating a district, that it would go all the way to, the houses that we dealt with at the last Heritage meeting that are on Main Street West in the 400s, past Casablanca, because that would tell a story. And it wouldn't meet the criteria because there's a lot of individual houses in between, and it wouldn't meet the threshold percentage-wise. But that whole thing, that definitely tells a story of the history of Grimsby. If you started it from the west end of Grimsby and went to the east end of Grimsby and said, these are all the homes that were established over the years, and these are the ones that were built by their kids and then their grandkids in between, and the lots that were severed off, yes. But this one little part, knowing what I know about the history of Grimsby, is not more significant than other little parts. And so, yeah, anyway, I'll let other people speak. I don't want to, I'm hogging the conversation.
Thank you, Councillor DeFlavio. Does anyone have any other comments? Yes, Councillor Corstangi.
Thank you, through the chair. I actually agree with Councillor DeFlavio. When I look at Heritage District, I see all of Main Street because I see the evolution of our history from it being an Indigenous trail to the fruit farms, to Dutch immigration, to all of that. And I understand why maybe a small part of it fits a heritage through the criteria. I always have a problem when one piece of history fits just because of architecture and where the tree line is and stuff like that. I feel like we focus on one part of history where we lose the rest of it, and it's up to us to just tell it. But I feel like there's an imbalance there on what history we're actually preserving. So I share your frustration in the sense that I wouldn't think that just that little part deserves it where nowhere else does. I do have a question though. If it was declared Heritage District, the houses and buildings that are not necessarily of heritage value, do they fall under any restrictions within the heritage designation?
Through the chair, I just had one other note from my previous comment I wanted to note was, I know there was a comment about stopping development using HEDs. I just wanted to be clear, HEDs are not intended to stop development. They're actually intended to guide change. So when that new modern layer is brought in, the district plan guides that. There's guidelines put in place, and that kind of brings me to Councillor Corstangi's question about that modern infill. So as that modern infill occurs, or if someone makes a change on a modern building, they would apply for the heritage permit just like any other heritage building within the area. And then they would have to conform with the guidelines and plan put in place. And then that's how you keep that cohesive character of that area. It's intended to guide that. So you're making sure it's in keeping with the standards and guidelines for historic places in Canada, and that it's compatible to the heritage building, it's distinguishable from the heritage building, and it's subordinate to the heritage building, so that those guidelines would be based on those principles.
Okay, thank you. That answers my question. And just to further on that, for those that wouldn't comply, do we have, or well, I would imagine we would have sort of a fair and equitable process to deal with these situations so that every situation is dealt with fairly, as opposed to, if you have the rules, I would imagine, in the district are very similar to heritage designations otherwhere in town. Would it be the same process as, say, on Main Street West, where it's not designated, as it is if it were to be in a district? And do we have that in place now, or are we just sort of going case-by-case basis?
Through the chair, just a question for clarification. So are you asking the designated buildings if it's the same type of protection?
Yes. Yeah, sorry, I know it was a little bit of a confusing question.
Yeah.
I can give an example if you want.
Sure.
Okay, so we had Nixon Hall on Main Street West designated. The trees were part of the agreement that an arborist was supposed to look at them before anything happened. The trees were cut down before that happened. There was no repercussion on that. It was decided that it was okay, and it was, it was just, So anyway, so I'm wondering if there is that fair process to every heritage homeowner, or if we're just going case-by-case basis, depending on what the situation is.
Through the chair, so similar to the designation process where you have the heritage permit come before Heritage Committee and it may be they want to put an addition on, whatever it is, the recommendation would come from staff of what they're proposing to do, and then council or Heritage Committee would consult, and we would give a recommendation to council, and then ultimately council would decide if that's permitted or not. But in this case, we would have guidelines to also follow, so we would also reference those guidelines as a part of the staff recommendation. So we would be looking at, number one, the heritage on the actual site, and then adjacent.
The consultant.
Thank you. It looks like Megan has a question. Go ahead.
Hi, sorry. I wanted to feel free to toss any questions our way too. I just wanted to provide a little bit of clarity. And I think, Bianca, you got at this, but it's important to recognize that at the HCD plan stage, that's where you are able to customize everything. So there's not a template that needs to be followed. That is to say, with alterations, you can select at that plan stage based on community input, whether or not you want alterations to be very restrictive or very open. For example, some districts are very particular about windows. So they've got a section that's devoted to what you can and cannot do with windows and a permit process that follows. Other districts, not that particular about it. So it wouldn't necessarily require a permit. It's all very customizable and based on the specific context within which the district is located. All that to say, there's also a staff delegation piece that Bianca mentioned, where it's not like every alteration, you're changing a window or you're changing the paint color on your door needs to go through council approval by any means. So there's a lot more flexibility in the HCD plan context than there is an individually designated property. And that flexibility is such because what's important about a district is the collection of the whole as opposed to just that individual property. So that kind of gets into the character a little bit, where the way that we address districts is through treatment of the character of the area. So as opposed to that individual tree, it speaks more to requirements for trees in general. So it's a little bit more, well, it's certainly a lot more customizable than an individual designation would be, but also allows for flexibility where the community expresses a desire for it. And allows you to really focus in on what matters about the area, the importance of the area, and direct efforts towards that historical significance that was identified. I'm not sure if that helps clarify, but just to add to that, we're more than happy to answer any questions about districts and plans in general too.
That was great. Thank you so much for adding that extra clarity. It sounds like, based on what for the feedback from the consultant and Bianca, it sounds like because this historic residential core has so much of that cohesive character, that's why this is what merits a good HCD, whereas we recognize that throughout downtown core all the way out to Main Street West, there is that character there as well, but it seems like it's more interspersed. So I feel like because we have such a good case in this area, and knowing the risks that are now out there with the provincial regulations that have been put in place, it sounds like because we have kind of a good shot at protecting the character of this one area, it sounds like that's something we should do it, at least to me. But thank you. Any other comments or questions? Yes, Councillor DeFabio.
So this might be answered when we talk about correspondence. Why would we have two designated properties in the Coles property that were recently designated by the OLT decision. Why would they be omitted from this? I mean, they're adjacent to a property that is included. They're designated properties. Why would they be omitted from this district?
Megan, do you feel comfortable answering that question?
Through you, Chair, yes, certainly. I'm a little daunting because I can see my gigantic face is hovering above all of you. So I don't want to raise a hand and cause a kerfuffle, but so it's a great question, particularly in something we often encounter where properties have various levels of recognition under the Ontario Heritage Act. What's important about the district is we don't necessarily look to see what protections are in place because it's not a tool to respond to development. Instead, we focus on what those cohesive boundaries or what those, our language is defensible boundaries are. So the way that we carved out the district, and maybe it would help if I pulled a map up as well, but it doesn't necessarily look at, we're certainly aware of the development, and that's a significant part of our report that looks at development applications that are active, as well as planning tools that are active as well. So it's kind of a layered approach, but we wouldn't necessarily exclude or include a property based on its current protection or developments that have been approved. Rather, the boundary is structured such that it's a defensible and cohesive boundary. So if you've got a property, for example, that's undergoing development, as you do in this area, it's adding in a layer of the Heritage Conservation District is not going to interfere necessarily with the approvals that are already in place. I'm not sure if it would help to pull up a map or if that gets at the essence of your question.
It sort of does. It's literally adjacent to one of the properties that's on there. Because, so it's not like it's a street. It's a street corner. So I don't know what the Burgess house there on the corner is included in this, but the two properties that are right next door, like that you could throw a rock at from this property, are not. Now I get also that across the street from those properties are, like a dentist office that is not of heritage value, and Burgess's, which I don't know, I guess you could question whether it's of heritage value, the old Burgess fruit store, which is Monk's Chocolate now. Okay, I think you answered the question adequately. What impact would a heritage district have on the decision that's already been made by the OLT, I guess, is the next question that I have. Because, so the Burgess Group, we received a letter from the Burgess Group that asked, that they be taken off of it. What impact does the Heritage District have on their ability to develop the land according to what the OLT has already approved?
Through the chair, I can, Megan, did you want to add, or I can speak more specific to the site, but I don't know if you wanted to add to that. Yeah.
Generally, thanks, Bianca. Through you, Chair. The short answer is things that have been approved already. This plan has not even been past the study phase. So an HCD plan would, once that comes into effect, that's when the kind of relationship to development would be struck. So in this case, anything that's been approved, OLT or municipal or any sort of planning framework that's been approved to date and prior to the date that a plan would potentially come into effect, there'd be no relationship. So it's certainly not going to retroactively affect any approvals whatsoever. And keep in mind too, the plan phase is the second phase of this, right? So the plan would respond to all of those development and other planning frameworks that are in place or proposed to be in place. It kind of catches it all up.
Thank you, Megan. Bianca, do you have anything to add?
Thank you. Through the chair, I was just going to add specifically for this site. So there is approvals already in place that stand independent of this. And so we've looked at kind of the timelines of when this HED will actually be put in place, and we don't think there's going to be any overlap at all. A lot of the work will already be well underway on the site when this actually happens. And I was just going to note, by proceeding to this next step to start the design guidelines, that will not impact that development in any way. And we would want that site to continue to develop, because we need that house to be restored. It can't wait anyway. So, but they would be completely independent of each other.
Thank you. So the last thing I have to say, and I'm sorry that I keep talking, but is that when I think of a heritage district, I think that there's a story to it. And as the chair pointed out, maybe that story will come out as a result of this process. But I would feel a lot more comfortable creating a district if I knew the story in advance, and I don't feel like that story's been fully told. That's all. You know, I don't feel like there's a story that is distinct to this set of houses that is different from the story of Grimsby, in a way that the story, like, again, I hate to keep harping on Grimsby Beach, but I think that Grimsby Beach has a story. There's a very specific story to that beach. And although it takes place over decades, because there's the religious part of the story and then the cottage part of the story, it's a continuous story, and it's geographically bound in one area. I don't think that this story is distinct to this one area. So I think the preservation is important. I think that there are similarities, but I don't see the story, and I keep harping on it. I apologize, but that's just the way that I feel about it. So.
Yes, thank you, Councilor DelFabio, and Garrett, go ahead.
Thank you, through you, Chair. I just want to comment on Councilor DeFlavio's comment there. I feel like what you're struggling with is the identity of Main Street East, and you keep bringing up Main Street West, and I think an important point to make is that, you know, historically looking at Main Street East and West, they were very comparable property or estates on big properties, but I think the important value of Main Street East is that even all of that surrounding development has happened over the last 100 years behind those properties, that cluster has stayed as intact as it is. And I think that's what we're trying to recognize here with that corridor. Oh, another comment. Something else that we've recently been learning about as well is a part of Grimsby's history. So we're always talking about like the tender fruit farming industry, but pre that, I think we're thinking like 1880s and prior, it was actually wheat and grain was a big part of Grimsby's economy. So that's another kind of part of the cultural landscape to look at as well. Thank you.
And I think that once the story continues to be told, that the proximity to the downtown will probably be a very important part of the story, because it's walking distance, unlike some of Main Street West, like especially the parts in the far parts of Main Street West, it's walking distance to downtown, so it lent itself well to filling in with newer houses and all those things, but we don't have that story yet. Anyway, that's it.
Thank you. And Bianca, you want to add something?
Thank you. Through the chair, I just wanted to note that there was a three-phased approach that was presented to council. And so my understanding was they were going to start with Main Street East and then move to Main Street West, kind of in this three-phased approach. So I think they've just identified like that main arterial road of the municipality and kind of divided into those three sections. Because of the fact that there is kind of a lot more adjacency with Main Street East and downtown, they ended up being studied together. But Main Street West was intended to be reviewed again down the road, so I was just going to note that.
All right, thank you all for comment. Are there any other questions or comments from the committee? And we have Brian going. Go ahead.
I'll be quick, don't worry. The two questions for town staff. The list on Appendix B, are those properties that are outside of the area that has been designated? So basically the other three areas, is that where that list of properties comes from?
Through the chair, yes, exactly. So when they were studying, they obviously identified value in all sub-character areas. It's just some were better suited for cluster designation and some were better suited for individual.
Can I go with a follow-up? For those properties, will a separate report be required for each, or is what Stantec has done in their report enough to be able to say we can apply that to those individual properties and put those through the process of designation?
Through the chair, we're definitely going to take the data from Stantec, but staff will conduct an independent evaluation for each of the properties, and they'll come through the designation research reports that you see coming monthly, and then we'll consult with Heritage Committee, and then you'll make a recommendation to council.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions, comments? All right, then I believe it's time to move on to our delegates. Is that correct? All right. Okay, first up I have Pamela Evans. Would you like to come up and speak to the HCD study?
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for having me this evening here. As a former member of the Heritage Committee who was against forced designation, a stakeholder in the study, and a Main Street East resident for over 20 years, I'm here to share some concerns I have with this study moving forward. A brief background from my perspective. The study's relevance is to address the perceived pressure of development by some residents. A hospital corridor study was recommended and supported by the region to address height concerns of future development along Main Street East. In response to the new hospital and future developments, the region was to pay $50,000. Grimsby would have paid $50,000. Unfortunately, it was voted down by 5 members of the last council, despite the Commissioner of Planning for the region appealing to council to rethink the study. With a hospital that will be 5 industrial stories and 2 developments that have been approved by the OLT to move forward, it's clear to see the area that has been challenged. Let's call it the would've, could've, should've approach, as turning it down left the area with pressure of development vulnerable, but it also now put impact on the perceived area that I live in. Then the request came from members of the Safe Main Group and the Historic Society requesting council to approve a Main Street East corridor study with the intention of designation, which leads us to this study. The stakeholders had 2 meetings. The public and major stakeholders had 2 meetings, all held by Zoom, which surprised me, as it was during the election period, and we were more than capable of having an in-person meeting. Some of the Main Street East residents voiced their concerns during the meeting. Sadly, we were voicing our concerns only to the consultants of Stantec and the town staff, as not one member of the previous council or those coming into council had showed up to hear the residents and their concerns. When this was voted on, I believe the budget was $300,000, and I think taxpayers should be asking what was spent on this, not to hear the concerns from the people that would be impacted, as many of us do feel we are being used as leverage against stopping development. The consultants have returned with areas to consider and recommendations. If its relevance is to address and guide development, I'm perplexed. When the Robinson Tunnels is suggested with the inclusion of the DeSantis property, as Robinson Tunnels doesn't have a high pressure of development. It does have several commercial buildings, nursing homes, 2 newer townhomes that appear to show as 1 property each. A couple duplex and a 4-plex. Some of the commercial once would have been homes that now have been readapted to offices. All this happened organically over time with limited loss, which speaks to not requiring outside involvement. More importantly, the town of Grimsby originally went from Kerman Avenue to Orchard Parkway up until 1970. Only then did South and North Grimsby amalgamate. The inclusions of homes from Robinson to Orchard Parkway doesn't make sense. That area would have been part of the town of South Grimsby, while from Orchard Parkway east would have been North Grimsby. Any property up to Orchard Parkway should be removed from this study. In terms of the study, I've seen no qualitative or quantitative data to support moving forward with an HCD. There's no supporting research that's been presented here. The consultants have a clause that excludes them from liability, that some information is third-party and hasn't been verified. At the last meeting, we were told we were all connected to the property at Main and Nels. I requested supporting information and was told it was presented. Up until 1970, we were in separate towns. There wasn't any research to show property values increase. I reached out to an appraisal company that actually challenged that theory and stated they're actually very challenging to appraise. Minimal comparables and testing designation impacts doesn't prove to increase the value. It actually decreases the value. Impacts of insurance. The consultants have provided a very vague statement that suggests we shouldn't have insurance issues. In the fall of 2021, this committee also heard from the former head of planning that there wouldn't be any further forced designations as property owners were going to the OLT and being successful. As Heritage Trust was also aware, while we're here, they're working on it. No protections are in place. There's no cost and loss supporting information. These properties can place economic loss on property owners. To say their values rise is misleading. The materials and cost of maintenance goes against any gain. Replacement for materials of these homes are 4 to 5 times the amount. Some work requires a specialized tradesperson, and you can wait up to over a year. I had prices for a roof quoted. Cedar was $140,000, engineered was $30,000. If designated, the decision is made for the owner. Environmental benefit and impacts. It's often stated preserving these old homes benefits the environment by keeping them out of the landfill. Sadly, the landfills are still filling up with homes from the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. Yet the environment these homeowners are expected to preserve their homes in isn't conducive to preservation without impact. It's a challenge making these homes energy efficient, and it's not always given the priority in what materials are expected. Other environmental impacts are the issues of living on a busy main street with constant vibration from traffic. Preserving these properties is important, then redirecting traffic away from them should also be relevant. Selling these properties. The market for these properties is small. Adding further hindrance narrows the market that much more, which makes them less desirable. The developer and every property owner in this boundary should be speaking to the economic impact statement. HCDs should not be used in this area. This is an area that has shown that it should have economic growth for this community. This committee in the fall of 2021 approved the designation of the property at Main and Nels. The developer didn't oppose it. We are constantly told this isn't to stop development, prevent us with making changes or having the property in a readaptive manner. However, this property is a perfect example that anything we want to do can come down to spending large amounts at the OLT, fighting for what we may want to do with our properties. This development has been considered a responsible development and has been approved and is still being linked to all of us in its history. Grimsby has a 95% retention rate of pre-1930s, with comments like, if we don't designate, the homeowners will demolish. That is completely false and misleading. 95% happened without forced designation, and these property owners deserve far more respect than entitlement to their properties. It's unrealistic to hold the future hostage to the past. Third parties supplied information that wasn't verified to present before you this evening. I've been on a registry since 2007 with no reason as to why. I've been provided 4 different dates, and with this report now saying sometime in the 1920s and the plaque I was presented stating 1880. I've paid insurance based on false dates. You're basing a decision on information that hasn't been verified. If inaccurate, What are the impacts to property owners? The reports here show residential properties that should be commercial. The section I live in, out of the 6 properties, I'm the only one that hasn't been commercial or medical at some point in time. Homes are listed as associated with fruit production, when perceived fruit barns could be outbuildings or carriage houses. This misinformation supports this report. However, it doesn't respectfully speak to accuracy. We are linked to the Nells in terms of fruit farming. I'm unclear how all other fruit farms who operated independently relied on the Nells property. The neutrals were considered the farmers of the North. Why are we not acknowledging to them? Good governance is accountability, inclusive of all, based on a fair and ethical practice that does not discriminate. This is a knee-jerk reaction to pressures from provincial government, and pursuing this is simply passing the buck on to us, lacking regard for our constitutional rights. This town has had a registry since 2007, over 15 years to put together a responsible approach to heritage, with financial support and insurance in place to support property owners. Once again, Grimsby has a 95% retention rate. Let's stop creating a false narrative that negatively impacts these property owners. People are surprised to learn the town of Grimsby is registered on the title of property upon designation. Securing a mortgage can be challenging when lenders realize there's a lien on the property. A more respectful approach would be a meeting with the Main Street East property owners only, town and council members, where property owners, we feel collectively heard. Find a more responsible approach that respects the property owners and doesn't take away their rights. After all, we have rights too. The Stantec consultants prepared a study for the town of St. Thomas. St. Thomas turned that down due to insurance issues. And I do believe there are other areas in this town that should be considered with responsible support to those homeowners for a cohesive, understandable plan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pamela. Does the committee have any questions? Or does staff or the consultants want to respond? It's just questions from the committee. Okay, Brian, yes.
Ms. Evans, thank you for that great presentation there. Just one question, just kind of in the last part of your piece here, you mentioned there was some third-party information provided by the consultants that was not, I think you said not verified, but I may have had that wrong. Can you clarify or maybe point out to some of that, speak to some of that information that you saw as unverified?
Certainly. So during the study period and creating, I guess, the Stantec report, there has been information provided. I believe some's from the Historic Society, some might be from members of the community, but the report in front of you that we received, it does state that it has not been verified. You're welcome. Anything else?
Okay, thank you very much, Pamela. All right, we'll head right next to our next delegate, Dave Drew, if you would like to come up. And I should have mentioned this before, but we have 10 minutes for the delegates. That's why an alarm went off a little bit before, just to be clear. Thank you, Dave, go ahead.
Good evening. My name is Dave Drew. I'm a community member on Town of Grimsby Planning and Development Committee, and I'd like to talk further about the Heritage Conservation District. If I may, through the chair, I would like to ask a few questions. First, those to Stantec, and this goes back certainly before my involvement in it, so I'm looking for some more detail and elaboration related to the steering committee representation and the process that was used related to that, the potential benefits of the steering committee process within this study.
Okay, Dave, if it's okay with you, we're going to ask if you can ask all of your questions at once, and then we can get Stantec to answer all of them if that's okay. Okay,
the second question related to the historic residential core area, and it really deals with how strong a case is it. I know the criteria is all laid out in the study, and I reviewed that information, but I know it's 25% of the properties, and it requires a minimum of 2 yeses in the criteria. But from an overall standpoint, looking for how strong a case is this to develop a heritage conservation district. I believe that's all the questions I have for Stantic. I have one for the staff.
Okay, thank you so much, Dave. Standing Tech, are you there still to answer any questions? Megan, go ahead. Thank you.
Hi, sorry, could the first question, could we just get that restated? I got the how strong a case piece. I can certainly speak to that, but the first question, I'm not sure I was clear on.
Yes, the first question deals with the steering committee process that was involved in the study. There was representation. I've read the various representation people that were involved in it. How well was that process carried out? What benefit was there by having a steering committee? And was there a positive outcome out of the steering committee process?
Okay, thanks for the question. The steering committee process, to speak to that first, is a relatively standard one, and from a Heritage Conservation District study perspective, the goal with it, as you noted in the report, is to get the local perspective from a variety of positions. So we involved, and it's something we work with the town on, but involved various representation from different committees at the municipality, as well as local representatives as well. I believe there was some interest as well from others, so we kind of opened it up there. As far as its effectiveness, from our perspective, it was very useful in shaping the recommendations in our report, both for the Heritage Conservation District area that we feel merits consideration as a district, and also in our additional recommendations that relate to properties that should be considered for designation, some planning and policy considerations we made as well. So I think it's hard to quantify, success or failure of a steering committee. Rather, I think we took some great feedback from that and certainly helped to gain that local perspective within our report. I think it's one piece and certainly not something that should dictate the success or failure of a project. Instead, just form a valuable component that we can not only present, which we did in the first committee meeting, but also get that feedback. So trying to address concerns, but more so shape the nature of the study and collect resources. That's one thing that we really focused on early, as far as getting that local knowledge, and also hearing a variety of perspectives. I think it's important to distinguish that it wasn't a committee designed, or really nowhere in the study process is it a question of, do you want a district? Do you not want a district? That's not a decision that we make. We look simply at the merits in accordance with not only legislation, but some of the toolkit and directions that are required from a policy perspective. So, from our perspective, we certainly gained a significant amount of feedback that helped shape our historical understanding of the area, led to the development of the character sub areas, and was helpful to us. The next question maybe builds into that, as far as how strong a case the area that we're recommending consideration for a district. In our professional opinion, our team, and I guess it's tricky because I think, we met initially with the previous Heritage Committee. So just to give a little bit of perspective, collectively, our team has worked on dozens of Heritage Conservation Districts throughout the province. Small ones, big ones, truly any type that you can imagine. We've had some involvement in, whether it's, urban cores, residential, commercial. From our perspective, the boundary is a defensible one. It is informed by the history of the area and representative in the built form of a collective and cohesive space that speaks to the history of Main Street East in this area. So I think it's a strong case for certainly a strong candidate for consideration. In our professional opinion, it's a defensible boundary and a district that would, in our opinion, again, withstand scrutiny as far as the boundaries go and the rationale for consideration. I'm not sure if that's what you meant by strong, but recommending a district is not something that we would take lightly. We're well versed in the litigative aspect of it, having represented clients on both sides of the table, so to speak, in OLT litigation. So we believe that it is a strong case.
Thank you. Thank you. And also thank you for the comprehensiveness of your overall report. So through the chair, I do have one question for staff that relates to the Grimsby downtown area within this study. In Appendix B, you've identified a large number of properties that are part of potentially additional work. What is the current status of that group of properties as it relates to heritage designation?
Thank you, through you, the chair. So they're not being recommended as a district in the downtown. And so each of those properties in Appendix B currently are on the Municipal Heritage Register. So they have demolition protection until January 1st, 2025. So our recommendation is that the downtown properties on that list be prioritized before they lose their protection, and then with hopes to get to all of them. But we have about 530 in the town under review right now, so we just like a focus on those key downtown buildings.
Okay, thank you, and thanks for your report tonight. Based on the information that I've read and studied, as well as the presentations tonight, I certainly support the recommendations of council related to this issue, and I appreciate your time.
Thank you so much, Dave. Are there any other comments or questions? Yes, Councillor DeFlavio.
Are we going to deal with the correspondence now too? Okay, all right, thanks.
Okay, moving on from our delegates, we are going to address the written correspondence that came in. So this is a written letter that came to the Heritage Advisory Committee on the Main Street East study. And I think I'm passing this over to Bianca to take, or how does this work? Because I don't have the letter in front of me. It's in the agenda, so let me just go all the way down to it. Okay, yeah, I can totally read it. Should we put it up? Yeah. It looks like we want to put it up on the screen. Okay. Excuse me, Gabe, would you like to speak to this letter, or do you want me just to read it for the committee?
I think you should just read it to the committee.
Okay.
The concern that we have is, I'm not sure.
Do you mind going to the podium just so that the public can hear? Don't mean to put you on the spot like this. I know. Thank you, I appreciate that.
Good evening. My name is Gabe DeSantis. We are the owner of the Nels Groot House at the corner of Main and Nels. We were recently granted a decision by the Ontario Land Tribunal, awarded us our appeal, identical to the plan that we submitted to council back in 2018, a 5-story building which keeps the heritage house in situ, and the house will be restored and come alive. The problem that we have being part of the HCD study is our future homeowners, the 153 people that will be moving into this building, will be born with a lot of these conditions on title, will have challenges with the overall insurance. Furthermore, the upkeep of the house will be borne by the condominium owners. We're hoping that the house can be carved off on its own. We're going through that process with the planning committee, but we feel strongly that with the heritage designation currently on the property, there can be no further occurrences that can come that can affect the development of those lands. A 5-story condominium will be built. We will go to the market in the spring. We hope to house all the new people that are about to get all these wonderful new jobs at the new hospital. That's our goal, not to have our project delayed and be weighted and coupled in a heritage study that actually has absolutely no further protection on the property that our lands are talking about. So we're simply asking for our lands to be removed from this study. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. I know we put you on the spot there, so thank you so much for coming up and talking. To the committee, do you have any questions for the delegate or to just respond to the letter we received, Councilor DeFlavio?
Yeah, I don't know what the final decision by the OLT was, so I don't know what's been approved. Is there an attachment between the heritage home? Is there a physical attachment between the heritage home and the new development, or is it divided, physically divided? I guess is the first question that I have.
Bianca, do you want to speak to that?
Through the chair, there is no attachment on the heritage building. So as for property line, some of it may encroach on the property line that exists for 133. I would have to confirm that.
So the reason why I'm asking is because this home is clearly of heritage value, but attaching it to, and it's designated already, but attaching all of the regulations that go with the Heritage District to the rest of those units, if that's in fact what's going to occur, as Mr. DeSantis has expressed, doesn't make any sense. Doesn't, so I don't know if the planning department is planning on dividing that property, the heritage property, from the gist of the property, because it makes sense from a preservation perspective. It allows for more control, I think, than having the whole thing together, but maybe it doesn't. I don't know. That's why I'm asking the question. I want to do whatever we can to preserve that property, but I also don't want to hinder all of the future condominium owners in their ability to do whatever they want to do with their little part of the property. So I guess I don't know if we need a legal opinion on that, or if you have an opinion on that, Bianca, but I'd like to hear what your thoughts are on it.
Through the chair, so firstly, I'll note there is an OLT decision here that stands, and right now we're talking about progressing to the next stage. It will not impact this site in any way, so I just wanted to note that. As for if the house is just included in the district rather than the parcel with the condominium, I would probably put that to the consultants on that defensible boundary piece to see by removing that if that would affect the defensibility of the boundary in any way. And then I would say that the committee could make a recommendation because council's ultimately going to decide this boundary. As Megan had mentioned, sometimes it changes slightly before the bylaws pass. So maybe the consultants can provide some insight on it affecting the defensibility, I think, number one, and then number two, make a recommendation to council from the committee on this piece.
Yeah, certainly on the defensibility, so many things to just break down quickly. So in our experience, it will have a lot of it depends on the way that the land is divided, right? From our perspective, exclusively as it exists in today, the priority for the boundary is the historic home. The district would have no relevance or speak in any way to any protections that would apply to the any sort of modern development that would occur adjacent or rear to the property. Certainly something that could be sorted out in the plan stage where we look at the specifics of property parcels. More so, though, to the defensibility of the boundary. I think this property, as I imagine that the rest of the Heritage Committee and community understands, and the landowner too, the significance of this property to the history of Grimsby and its direct tie-in to the streetscape here along Main Street East. So it is our professional opinion that the boundary should include this property. That's not to say that it council will necessarily agree with that, but that's at their purview, right? So I think from a historical perspective and from a defensibility perspective, our recommendations are that the Nels property, specifically the house, be included. So the relevance to the division of land is something that would be looked at in more detail at the plan stage, but certainly we're not unfamiliar with condo developments within heritage conservation districts, and that's something that is often accommodated and can be addressed, particularly given the fact that this has been approved through the OLT. There'll be no interaction and something that would be addressed appropriately at the plan stage.
Okay, thank you very much for providing that clarification. I want to pass it to Bianca for one more question, just for some clarification.
Thank you. Through the chair, Megan, we just wanted to more specifically ask if, say, the site was divided and the Heritage House was retained as a separate site from the condominium, and we proceeded with the district, including the original parcel with the Heritage Building, and then the adjacent parcel had the condominium, or however that configuration worked out, where the Heritage Building and the bylaw for the individual designation was amended, say for just that parcel, if it was subdivided, would there be an issue with that condo piece being left out and just the Heritage House being included, just for the committee's reference?
The short answer is no, there wouldn't be an issue. The priority is on the historic building that's there, and we understand that it's subject to the potential division. And my apologies, I should be better versed in the specific development, but no, the priority would be the heritage home, not the modern buildings.
Thank you, Megan. Councillor DeFlavio?
Thank you. I imagine because it's designated already, that the same concerns would be in place anyway, because it's a heritage home, and there are all kinds of restrictions on heritage homes. If it's not divided from the overall property, a lot of those same concerns would be on those condominium owners if it's maintained as one part anyway, wouldn't it? Like, I mean, it doesn't, I feel like the concern is already there with the heritage designation. So dividing that home from the overall property is probably the solution to all of that either way, whether it's a heritage district or not. And I think that a lot of the concerns are already there because it's a designated house. And I think that part of this heritage district is the home across the street from it on the south side, which is also part of the district, is of heritage value as well. And so if you remove this one, you also have to remove that one, which raises other concerns. So I think we need to find a way to work with the developer to divide that house, preserve that house, which is already going to happen because it's a designated home, and they've expressed that they're going to preserve that house, and make sure that everything can go forward as it should, while preserving that property. I think that the developer wants to preserve the property, but dividing that off, I think, is a very important part of the process, and maybe Megan could speak further to that. I don't know if she's familiar with other properties that have a shared heritage and condominium development where that sort of thing's happened before in her experience. Thank you.
Yeah, through you, Chair. There's a number of kind of similar patterns here that we see. So we've been involved in developments that have gone through that land severance process, where you sever the land that contains the historic, in this case, we'll call it a home, that's applicable here. So where you would sever that part and the rest of the land would be subject to development, whether that's condominium development or individual property severances. So think, for example, a subdivision development where you would get a heritage property severed and either incorporated into the development or a development built around it. I will apologize, the condo, I understand that there are very specific planning frameworks around condo corporations that I am not well versed in. But it is certainly something, particularly given that this is not, there's no attachment here. The house will be standing on its own. Certainly something that would fall under a planning framework. And I mean, a recent study that we completed in Vaughan looked at there were a number of modern condominium developments that we addressed through a boundary modification, essentially. And that's something that I think would be applicable here as well. Particularly given the timeline of all of this too, right? It's not that, it's something that could be addressed very early on. I could give other examples, but it's probably best to leave it there.
Thank you, Megan. Councillor DeFlavio, did you want to say one more thing? Yeah,
and I'm sorry for going on. If there were a shared element in the home, which there isn't, because when I think of a condominium, I think, like, what's the shared element? Unless it's parking, perhaps. I don't know what the shared elements are because I don't know the specifics of the design. But it's commercial, right? This is going to be a commercial use, or is it going to be mixed use, commercial and residential? Or is it going to be 100% commercial, the redevelopment of the home?
Through the chair, I believe it's commercial.
So again, it's the only commercial portion of the property as far as I know. The rest is all residential. So it makes sense to divide it and deal with it as two separate parcels. And then if you leave it in the study area, which again, I don't agree that it really works as a district, but I'll let council make that decision, but I think that if you divide it, then it's not an issue anymore. So I think that hopefully solves the developer's concerns. But we might want to seek legal opinion on that and make sure that that is all clear. Thanks.
Through the chair, I was just going to say that maybe the committee can make a recommendation that be considered, and then staff can look into it, and that's something we can bring forward to council for consideration. While we look at the intricacies of the site and make sure that this is something that would work from a legal perspective. There's a couple options. You could amend the designation bylaw if the property lines changed, so if they became separate sites, or you can also look at like an R plan where you have a defined area that has the heritage piece, and then the R plan has a specific area that's registered on title for the bylaw, so.
If I could, sorry, as long as it gets preserved and it gets restored, I'm fine with any of that. So the goal was always to protect the heritage property. If that means that that occurs later on as a result of that, what you're talking about, that the Heritage Committee recommends that once the redevelopment is completed on the site to the, you know, to staff's liking, that it be considered for division, for land division, then I'm in favor of that, because it doesn't make sense to keep this as one parcel of land anyway. I think from a management perspective and all of those things. So yeah, however you think that should be worded, I would support that.
Through the chair, I think probably what's best is if the committee recommends that this come back to staff for us to get the information we need, and then we'll bring something to council once we have the additional information. And if we're able to obtain it before this goes to council, then we'll have both of those pieces involved in the staff report. So I think that would be the best to.
Okay, so just to clarify, what is the hope to bring to staff? Okay, thank you. We had some time to write out a new amended resolution. And I want to give this to the committee to obviously see what we think of it, but from the concerns that have been brought forward, and it sounds like what the consultants and staff have said, that there is still a lot of opportunity in phase 2 of this study to determine those boundaries a little bit more, and see about separating the house from the rest of the development. But I think what might be a good idea to put forward today is, I'll just read the resolution and see what you guys think of it, okay? So something along the lines of resolve that the written delegation of Wood Bull LLP be received, and that staff look at the possibility of the district applying to the lands containing the Heritage Resource House at 133 Main Street East only, rather than the modern layers. And then we could say something along the lines of further, the Heritage Committee recommends that the heritage resources at 133 Main Street East be included in the district boundary. So really focusing on the house rather than the modern additions being added, because the OLT has already gone through, like, this is happening regardless. And it sounds like what's been said today, nothing's changing that. So, but we can still put this through to see what that could look like before it goes to council, perhaps. I'm not sure. What do you think? Yes, Councillor Costangi.
Thank you, through you, Chair. Maybe possibly have staff look at it from all 3 options, leaving it completely in, severing just the house part, and then redefining the boundary to keep the whole property out, and what that would look like in all options. Another thing would be if we are looking at a heritage tax incentive, how that would affect that property as well, because if it's severed, then it would probably still qualify. If it's not, and you have all this modern development on it, what would that look like? So that might be an important piece to sort of look at in those options as well.
As we're writing that, I did have a question about what the next step is. Terry, did you want to address that? I mean, on the overall plan. So where we go next, and what the next part of the process is, and how this carries out.
So tonight, we're just looking for a recommendation from a technical level from this committee. There will be a verbal update for Planning Committee on July 19th, attached to the report that was written to this committee. And then on August 8th, that report will be on the agenda, and the consultants will be able to speak to all of council. So all of council would have an opportunity to ask questions about the study as well at that time. Excuse me. And we'll hopefully have that legal opinion at that time as well, to be able to talk about how that could work as well for Gabe's situation. And there will be an opportunity to delegate as well.
Through the chair, so the question is regarding next steps after council proceeds with pursuing a district. So if council, at the council meeting, council have 2 choices: proceed with the district or choose not to designate the area. If council proceeds, then we commence the second phase of the study, which will be the development of the Heritage Conservation District Plan and the associated guidelines. And that will kind of be a longer process where we actually consult with all the heritage property owners and things like that. There'll be 2 to 3 engagement sessions for that for the property owners alone, and then there'll be some stakeholder pieces as well. And then after that, the staff and the consultants will recommend a district plan and guidelines for council's consideration. And then following that step is when you actually have a defined boundary that's defined with a designation bylaw. And then after that step, actually, you know what, let me put up my slide here. There, that's a little easier. So we're right here, right now. So this is the next step here. Council will proceed with the district or not. Then the guidelines will be prepared, and there'll be the engagement sessions. Once the second phase piece is finished, where we have all the consultation, then we will have the public notification, and council will consider the recommended district plan and guidelines and the designation bylaw. And then council will choose to designate the area by bylaw, or they'll choose not to. And then that decision, a notice will be served to everyone, either way, what they decide. And then there's an objection period for property owners who want to appeal the designation.
Through you, Chair. So in parallel to this, can I assume that some of the properties that didn't make the cut because they weren't, it wasn't, didn't meet the threshold for district, but were of value from a heritage perspective, will be being dealt with on a one-by-one basis by staff to get those in? Because as we talked about before, we're under a pretty tight timeline to deal with these properties. So that's going to be a parallel process separate from what the consultant's already done? Yeah.
Yeah, through the chair, right now we're working on Main Street West. We're going to try and do these kind of together so that we can work with each property owner, and it's also a good opportunity for the neighbors to discuss these things. So we'd like to do them kind of like in groupings as we move along. So yeah, we'd like to see the downtown be prioritized as well, as the one-off sites that you've seen on the list. And then after that time period of January 1, 2025, the assessments aren't going to stop. It's just there's no interim protection. So we'll continue to assess.
All right, thank you. Okay, we have an updated potential resolution to receive this, to incorporate Councilor Costangi's suggestions, to say that the letter be received and that staff look into the options regarding the heritage property at 133, 137 Main Street East in regards to the HCD boundary. And those options, of course, would be all options that are possible and what the impacts would be. And so from my understanding, then that would go with council on the August 8th meeting. Is that correct?
Through the chair, so usually Heritage Committee would make a recommendation, and then council would approve that recommendation before staff would move to the next step. But in this case, we'd like to have all the information available to council, so we will do our best to get that for that meeting.
Okay, thank you for clarifying. All right, so can I then put this forward?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, everyone. Okay, so my resolution here is resolved that the written delegation Woodbull LLP be received and that the staff look into the options regarding the heritage property at 133, 137 Main Street East in regards to the HCD boundary, and further that the Grimsby Heritage Advisory Committee recommends that the heritage resources at 133 Main Street East be included in the recommended district boundary. Do I have a mover? Councilor DeFlavio, thank you. All in favor?
Okay, sorry, I'm confused.
Am I not doing this correct?
Did you read this piece?
Yes. This is just...
This one, instead of this one.
Oh, is that what we decided?
Yeah, I think
Oh, okay. I see what you mean now. Thank you. All right, let's do this again. Thank you. Thank you. Resolved then that the written delegation would Bull LLP be received and that staff look into the options regarding the heritage property at 133, 137 Main Street East in regards to the HCD boundary. Do I have a mover? DeFlavio, thank you. All in favor? Thank you, everyone. Apologies for that. This page is just, doesn't look great. Okay, from this, then we'll go through the rest.
Yep, you receive the delegation.
Okay, so we'll receive the rest of the delegations then. First is for Pamela Evans. Resolved that Pamela Evans' delegation be received. Do I have a mover? Karstanji, thank you. All in favor? Thank you. And a resolution for, oh gosh, it's all messed up, for Dave Drew. Okay, then resolved that the Dave Drew delegation be received. A mover. Ryan Riley. All in favor? Thank you. All right, so we have those delegations are all taken care of. All right, we're going to head to the consultant next. Anyone have any final questions for the consultant before we put forward this resolution? Yes, Member Riley, go ahead.
Through you, Chair. I don't know if it's for the consultant or town staff, but just one of the question came up just after hearing the delegations. There was one comment made around just the insights around property value. Is it possible for us to get some information around recent heritage cultural districts that were designated, I guess, whatever the word is, to see what the impacts were on property values, to see if we can validate any of that information about whether it does improve, it causes them to decline. Just be interesting to get some insights on that, because I think a lot of the concerns raised by, through some of the comments, also the delegation around that area, if we have any recent examples, can we get some actual facts on it?
Megan, do you think you could answer that? Do you have any information on that?
Yeah, I was just looking up to see, so the Heritage Resources Center have published a study, I want to say in 2010. I was just looking it up to see if I could send along the link. Unfortunately, I mean, that's 13 years ago now, but it was a comprehensive study that looked at not all, but I want to say a couple dozen heritage conservation districts across the province, wide ranging from, you know, the big fancy places to the small workman cottages. And it did show an overall net benefit to property values, as well as a number of other community-based metrics that they used. There's not been anything done, to my knowledge, in the last few years, and I know real estate is one of those things that is shifting and continues to shift, but I'm certainly happy to pass along that study. There are some other resources that the province provides. They're kind of the keeper under the Ontario Heritage Act that speak to the benefits of districts. And I can certainly talk about those, but looking for the concrete studies, the University of Waterloo's Heritage Resource Center is your best bet. If you give me just a minute here, I'll grab the report, which I'm guessing Lasha is looking for as well.
If we can't find the link tonight, we'll be happy to pass it along to staff to forward to the committee at a later date.
Okay, that's great. Thank you so much. I do have one more question. I know we've been on this for a while now, but just one question. We've had some conversations throughout today about, you know, the difference between designating on part 4, like individual designations versus the full HCD under part 5. And I know like throughout these committee meetings, we've, been talking, like staff have been doing a great job with designating houses individually. We've been coming forward with, 3, 4, 5 designation reports each meeting. I just wanted some clarification. If this doesn't go through and then we need to rely on like part 4 designations for the individual houses. I know you mentioned somewhere in the report about like the intermin protections under section 40.1 of the OHA. So that means that if, that would happen if we're still in phase 2 of this study and we go past January 1st, 2025, and now all these properties are no longer protected under the register. If we're in phase 2, we could put in an interim protection under the Ontario Heritage Act. Could you just clarify what that means if that doesn't pass?
Megan, do you want me to start, and then I don't know if you have something to add through the chair. So I did note that in my report that we haven't used the interim protection. That's something that council could consider using. You can't have it within a certain threshold. I believe I can't remember now, if it's within 2 years maybe. So we haven't used it yet, so we can still use that. You have to be within the HCD study process in order to use it, and that's something that council could consider if we wanted to provide some interim protection while the study was underway. If they decided not to go with a district, that's not something they could put in place. Yeah, and I was also going to note that that tool should only be used when something's at risk. So with the properties being removed from the register, that would put immediate risk on the value of the site or within the district. So.
Okay, thank you for providing that clarification. Any other final questions for our consultants here? Okay, thank you so much for answering all of our questions so thoroughly and for staying on with us for this long. Okay, let's then put forward the next resolution for the consultant presentation. So resolved then that the consultant presentations be received. Do I have a mover? All right, Brian Riley. All in favor? Okay, thank you. Okay, great. Okay, so next up oh yes. Thank you, Megan and Alicia. You're welcome to head on out, and thanks again.
Thank you so much for having us. We'll pass along the link to that report once we've got a link to it here. We'll pass it through Bianca, but thank you to the committee and the community as well.
Thank you very much.
Okay. All right. We do have, now next up is for the staff report. So this is a long one here and we can discuss it, of course. Resolved that the report GH 2313 staff recommendation report for Main Street East Heritage Conservation District study dated July 11, 2023 be received. And that the consultant's recommended boundary known as the Historic Residential Core be designated under Part 5 of the Ontario Heritage Act, and that staff work with the consultants to commence the second phase of the study and develop the associated district plans and guidelines, and that the properties in Appendix B be considered for designation following the recent passing of Bill 23, and that prioritization be given to Part 4 designations for properties located within the downtown core. That was a mouthful. Any concerns or questions, or do we have a mover for this? Yes, Brian.
Question, not the mover yet. Through you, Chair, the delegation that was received from Bull LLP was with respect to the boundaries. Should we not amend the recommendation around that piece? Are they going to be, it feels like that has some impact on that recommendation we're making, and I don't know that we can make that recommendation because we've asked for clarity or further insights on that one. So I might suggest we maybe pull that one out, at least separate from those. I think it might create some conflict.
Does anyone want to respond or have anything to add to that? Okay, Bianca, go.
I was just going to add, maybe you could just work it into the resolution, because the actual boundary is not going to be established yet. This is to proceed to the second phase of it, which is the establishment of the actual district plan. So I just don't want to stop the commencing the second phase of the study to address this piece, because this is something that we have lots of time to work towards. So I would just work that in, maybe as an additional resolution, and that maybe the boundary, or that the property at 133 to 137 be taken into consideration for the final boundary.
Through you, Chair. Yeah, that works. I think that the big concern I have with that one is we talked about that one a lot. I remember, I don't know how many months ago it was, but that property, I mean, it sat dormant for so long, and the risk of that, just losing it all together. But then you hear the consultant side of it, which it's really critical to that story that's told. So then you wonder if that defensible boundary and the whole district is at stake because of that property being missed. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword. It's kind of, it's tough. I guess it'll depend on how long that process takes for it to go through and what the true impacts are of that.
Through the chair, I was just going to add again, by us moving to phase 2, that development will not be impacted in any way. So.
And it does sound like either way, it's when we get to phase 2 is when we discuss those boundaries, is from my understanding. Okay, so I'll need to think about how I work this in.
I think he's talking about the consultant's recommended boundary. Oh, I see. Yeah, okay, so maybe we'll just say, excuse my.
Okay, thank you, Brian, for bringing that up. I think, given all the conversations we've had so far, I think it's important to add that in. And I think it's also important to, recognize, as the committee, we're here from a technical standpoint, to the merits of this, from a technical heritage standpoint, merit being named HCD for recommendation. And I think, so thank you for all the conversation, and thank you, Bianca, for helping me write all of these things. Okay, so let's read that again and see how this feels. Resolved then that the report, staff recommendation for the Main Street East Heritage Conservation District study be received, and that the recommended sub-character area known as the Historic Residential Core be designated under Part 5 of the Ontario Heritage Act, and that the boundaries for the designated area be established following the review of options for the property at 133, 137 Main Street East. Does that sound okay? Awesome. Okay. Yes, okay, I just wanted to make sure that that sounded good. Now I'm going to read the whole thing one more time. Okay. Resolved that report GH 2313 staff recommendation report, Main Street East Heritage Conservation District study dated July 11th, 2023 be received, and that the recommended sub-character area known as the Historic Residential Core be designated under Part 5 of the Ontario Heritage Act, and that the boundary for the designated area be established following the review of options for the property at 133, 137 Main Street East, and that staff work with the consultants to commence the second phase of the study and develop the associated district plan and guidelines, and that the properties in Appendix B be considered for designation following the recent passing of Bill 23, and that prioritization be given to Part 4 designations for properties located within the downtown core. Do I have a mover? Awesome, thank you. Okay, we have Councillor DeFlavio as our mover, and all in favor? Thank you very much. All right, that's been carried. Whew. Great work, everyone. And thank you all for all of your attentiveness and all your really great questions. I think that was a good, important discussion to have. And now we're going to move on. All right, so moving on then to our list of designation research reports for this evening, we'll begin with the property at 400 Main Street West. And Garrett is going to be doing them all.
Thank you, through you, Chair. Should I run through them all, or are we going to pass the resolution after each? Okay. Staff would like to note to the committee that all property owners have been given notice twice of the proposed designation of their properties. Staff are working collectively with property owners to address any questions or concerns they may have. We would also like to thank the Grimsby Historical Society and community members for their contributions towards the preservation of these buildings. Staff recommend that the property at 400 Main Street West be designated under Part 4 of the Ontario Heritage Act. Staff have concluded that the property has met 4 out of 9 prescribed criteria of the Ontario Regulation 906. The property meets the criteria for design and physical value because the structure at 400 Main Street West is representative of the Edwardian style. The features unique to the building are the hexagonal balcony above the porch on the front facade, corbels supporting the soffit on the dormers, and the witch's hat detail on the end of the rafters of the hipped roof. The property meets the criteria for historical and associative value because 400 Main Street West is associated with the Smith family. The property was under the ownership of the Smith family for 2 centuries. The Edwardian residence was built by Robert Owen Smith, the great-great-grandchild of John Smith, who was the original Crown Land Grant recipient in 1787. The house also has associations with the farmerette movement during World War II. The property meets the criteria for contextual value because the dwelling at 400 Main Street West is physically, functionally, and historically linked to its surroundings. Constructed by Robert Owen Smith in 1913, the house was built so that he no longer had to commute from his home on Kerman Avenue. Collectively, the 6 generations of Smith farmers worked the property for over 200 years, historically linking the parcels and buildings to John Smith, the original Crown Land Grant recipient. Based on the assessment of cultural heritage value or interest and significant findings, staff recommend that the property at 400 Main Street West be designated under Part 4 of the Ontario Heritage Act. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Garrett. Any questions from the committee? I do have one question in terms of the heritage attributes being designated. I know it's mentioned in the report about like the setback from the road and the trees in the front. Do you think it's viable to add that to be designated too, like the setback? I don't know if I see it in the heritage attributes unless I'm missing it. I know they are in some of the other reports, but I know in other designations we've done recently, we've designated that setback as well as like kind of the space between outbuildings and the home and the trees in the area.
Through you, Chair, yes, I would like to add that in.
Do I have to do anything for that? Do I have to think about more resolutions? Oh, no.
While you're rewriting it. While you're in the process of rewriting it, the photo that you show of the farmerettes in front of the old barn, unfortunately is proof that the barn that's there is a modern barn, because it would have been built, the farmerette movement was only 70 years ago, so that barn is going to be a newer barn. The one that's there is just a standard modern barn, but it's a tragedy that old barn was torn down because it's a really, there have been fires on the property in my lifetime, so who knows what the cause of the original barn being torn down was, but that barn in the photo, I would have insisted that it be part of the designation if it was still there. The barn that's there now is not really a part of the historic nature of the home, in my opinion, so it's not an important part, but it's tragic that the other barn was lost, though.
Thank you for bringing that up, and that also reminded me that I wanted to comment on the figure 14, the photo above that of the farmerettes that are posing in front of the house. They just look so happy, and I would love, like, at any point in the future, if there was ever a plaque about the farmerettes, which I think there should be, because that's a really, important story to tell and quite, important to the narrative of that area. But I think that photo should be right on that plaque, and I just needed to share that. Anyway, any other comments, questions? Okay, we have another amended resolution. Thank you to Bianca's brilliance. Let's see how this one reads. Resolved that 400 Main Street West be designated under Part 4, Section 29 of the Ontario Heritage Act, and that a notice of intention to designate be issued in accordance with the Ontario Heritage Act, and that the trees and setback from Main Street be included as character-defining elements. Do we have a mover? Thank you, Brian. All in favor? Wonderful, thank you so much. All right, thanks. And next up then, we'll have Garrett again speak to the designation research report on 482 Main Street West. Go ahead, Garrett.
Thank you, through you, Chair. Staff recommend that the property at 482 Main Street West be designated under Part 4 of the Ontario Heritage Act. Staff have concluded that the property has met 4 out of 9 prescribed criteria of the Ontario Regulation 906. The property meets the criteria for design and physical value because the structure at 482 Main Street West is a rare, unique, and representative example of the Ontario Regency cottage style. 482 Main Street West is a 1.5-story house built with a structural brick exterior walls laid in a Flemish bond pattern. Some key physical attributes include the hipped roof with a front-facing gable, gabled dormers facing the east and west facades, the hand-thrown red brick facade, and the symmetrical fenestration. The property meets the criteria for historical and associative value because 482 Main Street West has direct associations with important figures in Grimsby's past. The brick house at 482 Main Street West was constructed in 1847 when Charles Albert Smith, a son of Isaac Smith Jr., inherited his father's working farm. Charles went on to become a very well-known local fruit grower within the township. The property meets the criteria for contextual value because 482 Main Street West is visually and historically linked to its surroundings. The small brick structure with its deep setback has largely remained unchanged since its construction in the mid-1800s. Despite the change in context surrounding the structure, the dwelling retains the long and dramatic approach. This quality is commonly seen on wealthy homes built on expansive properties in the early 1800s and was most likely the intentions of Isaac Smith when the house was constructed. Based on the assessment of cultural heritage value or interest and significant findings, staff recommend that the property at 482 Main Street West be designated under Part 4 of the Ontario Heritage Act. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Garrett. I was really excited to see, I've never seen this house before. It's a fantastic house. I mean, I guess, so I was really excited to see it on as this report come through, but also like commending the homeowner for the job he's done restoring and preserving the character of the home and making the porch, kind of bringing the porch back to what it was before. So I think that's really fantastic. So well done to the heritage homeowner here. Any questions, comments from the committee? Okay, I'll read this resolution. Okay, the resolution here says resolved that 482 Main Street West be designated under Part 4, Section 29 of the Ontario Heritage Act, and that a notice of intention to designate be issued in accordance with the Ontario Heritage Act. A mover? Councillor Corstangi, thank you. And all in favor? Wonderful, thank you very much. All right, we'll move on to our next report. This is 123 Main Street West, also to be delivered by Garrett. Go ahead.
Thank you, through you, Chair. Staff recommend the property at 123 Main Street West be designated under Part 4 of the Ontario Heritage Act. Staff have concluded the property has met 4 out of 9 prescribed criteria of the Ontario Regulation 906. The property meets the criteria for design and physical value because the structure at 123 Main Street West is representative of the Italianate architectural style. Italianate architecture in Ontario gained popularity from the 1850s to the 1900s. The Italianate structure at 123 Main Street West is 2.5 stories and a red brick building. Key Italianate identifying features are the arched window and door openings, corbels below the eaves, tall windows, and the multi-story bay windows. The property meets the criteria for historical and associative value because 123 Main Street West is associated with Nathaniel Pettit, a United Empire Loyalist settler, Robert Lilly Gibson, Richard Allison, and the Dolmage family. The structure at 123 Main Street West was built by Robert Dolmage and his wife Frances in 1876. The Dolmage family was involved with the community and local politics. The property meets the criteria for contextual value because 123 Main Street West is a landmark. The house stands prominent within its landscape and is the only example of a red brick Italianate dwelling within the immediate surroundings. Historic newspaper clippings refer to the intersection as Dolmage Corner, and at one time the property was known for its beautiful gardens that were established and tended to by the daughters of Robert and Frances Dolmage. Based on the assessment of cultural heritage value or interest and significant findings, staff recommend that the property at 123 Main Street West be designated under Part 4 of the Ontario Heritage Act. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Garrett. Any questions regarding this property? Awesome. All right, then I will move for the resolution here. Okay. Resolved that 123 Main Street West be designated under Part 4, Section 29 of the Ontario Heritage Act, and that a notice of intention to designate be issued in accordance with the Ontario Heritage Act. Can I get a mover? Councilor DeFlavio, thank you. And all in favor? Thank you. Okay, great. Okay, and on to, I believe, our last report of the evening, a research report for the designation of 3 East Street. And Garrett, I'll bring that to you once more.
Thank you, through you, Chair. Staff recommend that the property at 3 East Street be designated under Part 4 of the Ontario Heritage Act. Staff have concluded that the property has met 6 out of 9 prescribed criteria of the Ontario Regulation 906. The property meets the criteria for design and physical value because the dwelling at 3 East Street is a representation of the wooden frame cottages that were built during the Chautauqua Methodist movement during the 1870s. The cottage's design is influenced from the folk Victorian design. The cottage at 3 East Street contains many of the elements of folk Victorians while also possessing vernacular features that are unique to the Grimsby Beach community. The property meets the criteria for historical and associative value because the dwelling at 3 East Street is representative of the Chautauqua Methodist movement. The summer cottages were built by the prominent Grimsby Bowslaw family, who originally owned the land that now encompasses the neighborhood. The family donated the land to be used as a temperance meeting summer campground. The success eventually resulted in the Bowslaw family building the community of summer cottages in the 1870s, including 3 East Street. Additionally, during the early 1940s, the house was inhabited by Livingston Cap Foster and his family. Cap can be heralded as an Indigenous war hero. Throughout the duration of World War II, Cap contributed significantly to the Canadian front lines. The property meets the criteria for contextual value because the historic dwelling at 3 East Street is representative of the age and architectural style that was historically found throughout the neighborhood. The core area of the neighborhood still retains a significant number of original cottages that were saved from historic fires and neglect. The cottage at 3 East Street is a strong example of an intact cottage surrounded by structures built very close together and have continued to expand over time. Based on the assessment of cultural heritage value or interest and significant findings, staff recommend that the property at 3 East Street be designated under Part 4 of the Ontario Heritage Act. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Garrett. I know I'm always excited when I see a Grimsby Beach Cottage come for designation. I guess, Councilor DeFlavio.
Yeah, the only question I have through you, Chair, is in the past, because I've been on this committee for a long time, we've discussed a color palette for repainting of, that would have been based on historical colors, because some of the colors, the pastel colors, probably didn't exist when some of these cottages were built. Has there been any consideration of, having a selection of colors, or is that too much of a, is that putting too much of a restriction on the homeowners down there? Because the painted ladies are part of the, the appeal. So I don't want to take away from that. But at the same time, if we're designating it, then are we going to say, these are the kinds of colors that are appropriate, these are the ones that aren't? I don't know.
Through the chair. So when we did the Grimsby Beach study, we found that there was a lot of value from the artistic movement that came into the Grimsby Beach. And we found a lot of value in that organic, artistic style that those cottages have. So we actually wanted to allow that to continue to happen. So that was something we didn't include within the design guidelines put in through the beach. And then I was also going to add, with the changes to the Planning Act, a lot of the comments on the outside of buildings no longer has a mechanism to implement. So that was the other piece.
Yes, Garrett, go ahead.
Thank you, through you, Chair. I just want to speak to some recent kind of historical findings in the beach neighborhood. So in recent times, we thought that a lot of these cottages were originally painted quite muted colors, but from speaking with some residents that have been conducting renovations, they've been realizing that originally a lot of these cottages were painted quite intricate, bright colors. So that's some new information that I think is worth knowing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, Councillor Kristanji.
Thank you, through you, Chair. So I'm very excited about this house, and I think we need to talk a little bit more about it, and we need to add a little more in our designation about it. It is an Indigenous war heroes home, and that's important for several different reasons. But speaking to the colors, it was restored back to more of its original state, which speaks to a little bit more to the dignity of what this home represents now that we know. So we haven't really discovered a lot of our diversity of history. So this home is very exciting because it's uncovered a whole story. So just to touch on a little bit of it, Cap Foster, his name's actually Livingston Foster. He was a genius. He skipped 4 grades in school. He entered high school age 10. He had a driver's license by age 11. He was a war hero. He went to go to the war. He went to learn to fly. He was so good. They didn't let him go. They made him an instructor. Finally, they let him go. Letters and letters came back to Grimsby of how fantastic he was. His father actually fought in World War I, and his father was a member of the Lickers family, which is one of the first Indigenous families on the census in Grimsby. His father was William Foster Lickers. He changed, so he fought in World War I. It was assumed that he had passed. He was captured and put in the salt mines of Germany. Word got back that, somebody had seen him in a hospital. Word got back to Grimsby that he was still alive, and Grimsby fought to get him back, to bring him back to Grimsby. He changed his name through a process called enfranchisement. I'm sorry if I say that wrong. So this, I think, is really important to have in our designation. This speaks to truth and reconciliation. It was a legal process for terminating a person's Indian status and conferring full Canadian citizenship. So he was a Lickers. He changed his name to William Foster. He named his son Livingston Foster after his captain, who was J.A. Livingston in Grimsby, hence Livingston Foster. So all of this naturally we can verify and stuff like that, but I think it's super, super important to have that Indigenous history. And I think for our Indigenous residents, it is wonderful to have identity and recognition of, such a hero in our community. And one of the things we did last year for the first time in the Remembrance Day ceremony was lay a wreath for Indigenous war heroes. And now we can put names to that, which I think is fantastic. So, huge shout out to the residents who are restoring this cottage back to its original state, and to honor this family who have dove into all this history to discover this. I do believe even the Warplane Museum is going to come out and hear the story and check it out and stuff like that. So this is just a fantastic story. So I hope we can get this out to the community some way. I think it's super special and important. Sorry, I rambled on a little bit, but it's huge, right? It's exciting and it's huge, and there's so many moving parts to it, and it really speaks to, uncovering. There's so much history. We know a lot of the history, but now it makes it exciting of what's the history that we don't know, and where are the identities that we haven't seen, and to find something this big of families, that are so important. I think it speaks volumes for sure. So I was really happy to see this one on. I actually got to tour the house, which was amazing, and a lot of work is being done to make it safe, to restore it. Great lengths are going to make sure that everything is from the time period. All the vents are Victorian era. They're all going to match and stuff like that. There is paint on the floor of designs and stuff where people in the past have painted. So it's really neat. There was a 1800s penny found, and ironically, the king on the penny was one of the kings that would have been in reign during the one of the wars and stuff like that. So there's some really neat coincidences, but if we could add some of that into the designation, I think it speaks volumes to the time period, but also for the Lickers family, as a tribute to them, and family that may be searching out some of their heritage. That might be a blockade because of the name change and stuff like that. So I'd like to see that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Councillor Cristangi, for bringing that forward and sharing that history. I saw a hand. Yes, Garrett, go ahead.
Thank you, through you, Chair. I just wanted to make another comment to Councillor Cristangi's info there. Some of that info was new to me, so I'm going to contact you and I'll definitely add that in. While I was conducting the research on the property and going through the old property abstracts for the Grimsby Beach neighborhood, I actually found that I believe William Lickers lived on Auditorium Circle. So right now I'm trying to go through and figure out which property that was exactly as well. So I'd like to bring, an additional report about him in the future on one of those properties. Thank you.
Yes, Councillor Cristangi.
Thank you. Just to add on that, I know that Cap Foster's, Livingston Foster's home was actually in his wife's name. So it sometimes that can be like an obstacle to finding some of the Lickers families that actually lived. I think it was quite a big family, but that's cool. I can't wait to hear about that.
Thank you, through you, Chair. Yeah, just to add on to that, I had a section in the report and I wasn't able to get all the research I wanted to kind of confidently speak to that. But I believe under the Indian Act at the time, there were like some provisions about Indigenous people owning property outright. And I feel like that's possibly why it was in the name of Victoria Wells Foster. So that's something I'd actually really like to research farther and put in this report. So we'll talk about it. Thank you.
Wow, that's some really powerful research that you're both finding. And I definitely agree that this should be commemorated in some way and shared. I think Councillor Cristangi spoke to it, but so often the narratives we have of Grimsby's history are quite narrow. And as more of these perspectives come to light, because there's just more room to have those conversations, I think it's really important to incorporate those into the stories we tell about our history. And I'm not sure if it's possible to do something more tangible with this history going forward. Like, I know it seems like we need to, get the right evidence to make sure that the narrative is backed by evidence. But I'm not sure, is there something we could more to do for this at this point? Yes, Councillor Cristangi.
Thank you. Through you, Chair. I think once we have everything, all the pieces put together with all the evidence to back it up, perhaps maybe sharing this information through our communications person to the community on special occasions like Indigenous War Veterans Day and things like that, so the community can learn, and consistently doing that for new residents and stuff like that, I think would be fantastic.
And I think that's so important because the narratives that we have been telling for so long are excluding a lot of populations that lived here. And I think, we can tell a very narrow version of history, and then that brings an assumption like, oh, well, it's because diverse populations didn't live here. But they did. They just lived quietly and silently, and they weren't in the records the way that they could be. So I think it is really important to bring those to light. And that just shows that, the community was more diverse historically than we think it is. So I definitely agree with that. And getting those voices out there and making people feel empowered and seen in the past, especially when it comes to Indigenous history, where I think so often, especially in Niagara, it's more of there's no reserve, right? There's no there's no tangible community for a lot of Indigenous people in Niagara. They're living amongst us, but they might not have stories to attach and to identify to. So I think that's really important. Yes.
Thank you, through you, Chair. I completely agree, and I think that's why this house is so important, because it does give something tangible that you can go and you can see and you can read about the story and once we have everything in pictures and stuff like that, and then go actually see, that physical space where he lived and stuff like that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that additional information. I think that's really important, and I'm really excited to see, as that story becomes more robust, what we're able to do with it going forward. So for now, though, I'll read the resolution I have in front of me and see if this lands where we want it to right now. Resolved that 3 East Street be designated under Part 4, Section 29 of the Ontario Heritage Act, and then a notice of intention to designate be issued in accordance with the Ontario Heritage Act. Do I have a mover? Councillor DeFlavio, thank you. Okay, and, oh yes, Councillor Cristangi, yes, please, go.
Thank you, through you, Chair. I just want to ensure that once we do verify information, find more, that it will go into this designation report. Okay.
Yes, go ahead.
The report's still in draft form, so we'll get all that firmed up before the bylaws passed. Thank you.
Thank you for confirming that. Okay, then do I have, we have our mover, all in favor then? Okay, thank you very much. Okay. Okay, really great discussions tonight, everyone. Thank you. Yes. Okay, so we do have, just going through the agenda, we do have one item for our announcements. So I'll go ahead with whoever that is. Or do I have that? No, I have. Okay, sorry, Bianca has one item for announcements. Thank you.
Thank you, through the chair. I was just going to remind everyone that the August meeting is only tentative if a statutory item comes forward that has a tight timeline. Otherwise, there'll be no meeting in August. Through the chair, I'll confirm, I believe I said July 21st would be the last chance for anything to come in for us to bring. But I'll keep you posted if I hear anything.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, so with that, then I guess we will adjourn our meeting. Thank you so much, everyone, for this really great conversation. Have a great night and a great rest of your summer then. Woohoo!